Okay, so in this video we're going to get the groundwork in place for what will become our material asset. And we're going to do that by taking our existing material. If we jump over to our shop network, we can see our existing material. We're going to take that and turn it into a digital asset, promote up some parameters from our surface shader that are going to be very useful to control from an outside perspective of our material. We're also going to begin to approach how we're going to manage working with different render passes. The vast majority of the workflow for working with render passes will be taken a look at in the next video, but we are going to get the basic architecture in place, if you will, for how we're going to manage our render passes down inside our shader. So with that, let's start out by creating the digital asset of our material. So I'm going to right click on our HDRI material and come down to create digital asset, and let's give this the operator name of HDRI material. I'll leave the label as HDRI material, save this to an OTL. Let's make it relative to the HIP file. I'll call this HDRI material.otl and accept. And I only want to install this in the current HIP file because we're simply creating this asset right now so that we can, as we further develop the asset, adding extra passes into our surface shader, adding displacement in towards the end of this DVD, we want to be able to work within the asset so that we can promote things up as we go, because otherwise if we develop the entire shader without having it as an asset and then had to turn around and promote everything up to our asset, we'd be dealing with so many parameters. It would be very easy to miss things. It would be very easy to get very confused, whereas if we're working as we're developing and adding things onto our asset, promoting things up to our asset as we work, it's going to be a lot easier to keep everything nice and organized. So I wanted to create this asset really as soon as possible, and this is a very good place to do that because we can now start to talk about render passes, and that really is quite an integral part of our asset. So I'm going to accept this. It's going to bring up the type properties. And the first thing I'd like to do over on the parameters tab of our type properties is create two folders. The first folder is going to contain all of the parameters that are there to basically customize the visual appearance of our shader in terms of the sort of things that an artist would be tweaking and re-rendering and working out exactly how they want the shader to look. The second folder is going to contain the more technical setup parameters, which are really, in our case, just going to be the paths to a variety of HDRIs, and they're more the sort of parameters that someone would come in and get set up just the once, and they wouldn't be tweaking while they're tweaking the properties of the shader. They'd simply be setting them to the known paths of their HDRIs and then leaving them because they're not really a visual parameter for tweaking. They're just a setup parameter that you need to get in place before you start the tweaking. So we're going to break it down into two folders. The first is going to be our shader folder, and the second is going to be our technical setup folder. So with those in place, let's go over and start promoting up some parameters that we have already available to us. Now before we do this, I want to minimize our type properties, jump inside our material, and I guess we can also drop this down so that we have the largest parameter area possible. We created this diffuse environment map parameter, but we left it with the parameter label color map, and that's not very descriptive. So before we promote this up, we could change it on the asset, but I'd like to have it changed down here inside the shader as well. And that's going to now have the label diffuse environment. So just given that the label diffuse environment, it makes a little bit more sense than being called color map. So now that we have that, let's bring back up our type properties, and I'm going to be promoting this into the shader folder. And let's jump over to from nodes, and I'm sorry, that's actually going into the technical setup folder. It's a path to our diffuse HDRI, and we're going to be promoting from nodes. It's inside our material, inside our surface shader. We have that diffuse environment parameter. So I do want to promote this. I don't want to prefix the parameter name or prefix the parameter label. We can promote that up into our folder, and that's going to give us, if we were to apply and just bring this over, and let's bring up the properties. So there's the parameters of our material. There's our shader tab, technical setup, and we can see there's a diffuse environment giving us a path to our diffuse convolution HDRI. Fantastic. So we've got that in place. If we now accept our type properties, because we have a little bit of work we need to do for some other parameters. if we look at what we've got in place so far, we've got our environment map. That's kind of a key parameter to promote up. But we also need to deal with a couple of settings for our occlusion VOPs, mainly just the number of samples, because that's something that we don't want to be hard-coded down in our shader. We do want the artist controlling the shader, controlling the material at the top level to be able to specify how many samples, because it could vary from project to project based on the size of the resolution of the render or the requirements of the film that you're trying to integrate into. So it's really not something that you'd want to have hard-coded in the shader. It's something we'd want to control from externally of the shader. We also would like to set up the basic sort of architecture for dealing with render passes. Now, the way we've got things so far, we've got these 3 different passes. And as we're working with these passes, we were simply wiring one or the other, or the final pass, into the color input of our output 1. And really, this is sort of how we want to work, because when we're rendering a single pass, we only want to calculate one part of the network, and that's the part of the network that relates to that pass, and we only want that pass to be output into the final image. So what we can do, we could create a switch VOP, and that would allow us to wire in all of our passes into the switch VOP, but only actually render one of them. We'd switch to the pass that we want to render, only that pass's network would get calculated, and the output of that would then be sent to the color of our image. So if we were to create a switch VOP and then drive the switch parameter of that switch VOP via a parameter up on our asset, which would specify which render pass we're dealing with, that would allow us to very easily switch between render passes without actually changing our network by rewiring things. And then in the next video, once we have that parameter in place, we can deal with ways of quickly rendering all of our passes and how we can, based on the name of the pass that we're rendering, automatically generate the file names, and just a lot of workflow techniques or workflow tricks for allowing us to very quickly, with this basic system in place, work with rendering and re-rendering various passes. So let's start out and let's create a switch VOP. And I want to name this switch VOP to switch render pass. And now that we have that in place, I'm going to wire in 3 different passes into our switch render pass. The first pass I want to wire in is our, what we know now to be our diffuse lighting pass, which, if you recall, is actually our ambient occlusion with map, because that's the ambient occlusion that contains both the shadows and the lighting. So that's going to be our first pass. And because that's our first pass, I'm actually going to drag that up here. Fantastic. The second pass I want to wire in is our ambient occlusion, which is basically just our shadows. And I am going to place that underneath our AO with map. And the final pass I'm going to wire in is our diffuse light, which we know now to be our fill pass. So we've got our diffuse lighting pass, our ambient occlusion pass, and then our fill pass. The order of these is important because it's going to have to correspond to the menu that we're going to set up on the switch parameter. And then we can take the output of this and wire it into the color input of output 1. So let's create a parameter now to control which pass we're switching between. So I'm going to create a parameter node. And let's call this render pass parameter, which can have the parameter name of render pass and the parameter label of render pass. Now, whilst we're down here in the asset, before I do promote this up to the asset and start working with the parameter, let's also deal with those sample parameters of the 2 occlusion VOPs. So I'm going to middle click on samples for AO with map and create a parameter node. And let's give this the name of AO underscore with map underscore num samples. Let's use that for our parameter name as well. And let's leave this with the label of number of samples. And I guess actually we could call this diffuse light samples. Fantastic. And repeat for AO. So let's create a parameter node. And I'm going to call this AO underscore num samples. And give that as the parameter name. And the parameter label in this case can be AO samples. So with all of those in place, we can now start promoting these up to our asset. So I'm going to grab the type properties of our material asset, and we're going to be working in the shader folder now. And inside the shader folder, I want to promote up our render pass and the two sample properties. So inside our shader, let's grab our render pass, promote that up, fantastic. I then want to create a new folder, and this is going to be for our diffuse portion of the shader. And with that folder in place, I want to promote up diffuse light samples and ambient occlusion samples. Fantastic. So we have our render pass. We do need to set up a menu, because if we were to apply this currently and take a look at our parameters for our shader, we see that render pass is simply a numeric value. It's an integer value, and this really isn't very intuitive, because we don't know, unless we know the internal structure of the asset, we don't know that a value of 0 is going to give us our diffuse lighting, a value of 1 would give us ambient occlusion, and a value of 2 would give us our fill pass. We just don't know that. If we set this up to be driven by a menu, then the artist on the outside gets a nice drop down where they can specify, oh, we're dealing with the diffuse lighting pass, or we're dealing with the ambient occlusion pass. So I'm going to, over on our type properties, grab our render pass, switch over to the menu tab, and we're actually going to create a menu to drive this. And we know that index 0, our first index on the switch, is our diffuse lighting pass. Index 1 is our ambient occlusion pass, and index 2 is our fill pass. If we accept this and bring up the parameters again, you can now see that we can switch between our various passes now using a much more intuitive interface. It's a lot easier to see. If I want to render the fill pass, I just switch to the fill and then render. So we can quickly demonstrate this. If I was to switch over to a scene view, let's just grab our camera real quick. Fantastic. So let's say I want to render our fill pass. So I've set the render pass to fill. I can then quickly render our view. Obviously, give Houdini a second to think about rendering. So just give it a second. There we go. We can see that is indeed our fill pass, and if I was to then switch this over to ambient occlusion, and then we can render our view. And give that a second to think. There's our ambient occlusion pass coming in, fantastic. Or we could switch this over to diffuse lighting. I'm just going to escape to cancel that, render our view. And we can see here is our diffuse lighting pass. Fantastic. I'll escape to cancel that as well. Close out and play. So we're dealing with the ability to specify our render pass. We've also got specific to our diffuse lighting, diffuse light samples, ambient occlusion samples, and the beginnings of where we can set up our HDRIs. Now, it's worth pointing out, obviously at the moment, dealing with the render passes as a simple drop down like this isn't really very intuitive, and we'll discuss that in the next video, because there should be, or really we need to take into account the fact that we'd really want to be able to render all passes at once, and also deal with the fact that we could have multiple instances of our asset in a scene, and if we did that, we wouldn't want to have to go to each one in turn and set passes for rendering. So we're going to look at a sort of higher level workflow of how we can deal with our render passes in the most intuitive manner possible. But for now, this is the basic architecture of our render passes in place, along with some of the other elements of our asset. And as we continue to develop our material, continue to develop our shader, we can promote more parameters up to our asset. So that is going to conclude this video, and we'll continue taking a look at our render passes in the next video. Thanks a lot, everyone.